Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, Executive Director of the Church State Council, and I'm here with my co-host Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, the world's best and oldest magazine devoted to, you guessed it, religious liberty. And we are trying our best to recover religious freedom from the political extremes. Well, what are we talking about today, Bettina, before we introduce our guest?
So we're talking about a subject where extremes often come into play, and that is the whole question of funding, state funding flowing to religious schools. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Is it constitutional? What do we think about it? And the case that caught my eye recently was one that's recently been filed on behalf of Jewish children in California. And it's a suit being filed under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the parents of these kids are saying, look, the government's giving out money to parents with kids who have disabilities to send them to schools that are going to meet their needs. Why can't we use that money for religious schools? What do you think, Alan?
Well, this is a double-edged sword. The way the Supreme Court is going, California is going to lose, right? We saw these battles years ago in New York, and they had different programs for providing disability services for kids attending religious schools. But the problem, of course, is that, we have a word for schools that are funded by the state. We call them public schools. And, what happens with government encroachment on all of this and government funding is they stop really retaining their uniquely religious character. So what happens when the state decides that all history curricula in any publicly funded school has to portray Israel as the colonial oppressor? That's not going to go over well in Jewish schools. But if they're taking government money, the state can tell them what to teach.
Yeah, you're right. It's a double-edged sword. And as you rightly point out, Alan, the Supreme Court is moving swiftly down a path, or has moved right down the end of that path and come to the point where it says that if a state is funding a secular enterprise or organization, then it has to fund also a similarly situated religious one. And to do otherwise contravenes the Religious Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. So, we've come to that point. So clearly this case falls squarely within current constitutional jurisprudence, right?
It does. It does.
And people may say, well, what's the problem with that? I know you've already talked about the problems that come, the strings that can come with government funding, but this is just such a sympathetic case. These parents want to do the best by their kids, and this is a special program for disabled children and to provide for their educational needs. And so it's, I don't know, it just seems a very sympathetic case to me, Alan. Can't we make an exception for this?
Well, you're from Australia, Bettina, so let me pose the question to you this way. I know that in Australia, the government has been funding religious education to a great extent, lots of dollars flowing to religious schools. And of course, we're Seventh-day Adventists, and we have a very active school system. But how religious a society is Australia, and has the government funding of religious education helped Australia become more religious, or has it had any impact? How do you see that?
You're asking questions like a lawyer, Alan, because you know the answers. So yeah, of course. Australia is a secular country, and the flowing of funds from the state to religious schools in the long term has been to the detriment of religious schools because they've become reliant on that funding. And now they're finding that their ability to maintain their religious identity is threatened by state regulation. And that comes along with the funding, right? So, yeah. And I guess that's the nub of this. Short term, it sounds like a good idea. Long term, funding from the state to religious schools, bad idea.
I'm reminded of Esau and Jacob. You know, he wanted the quick fix of some porridge now, but the consequences were long term.
I like that. I like that very much. On that note, shall we bring on our guest for today, who is going to be addressing a little bit about this, proper relationship between church and state?
Our guest today is a law professor, Frank Ravitch, professor of law in the Walter H. Stowers Chair of Law and Religion at Michigan State University College of Law, where he also directs the Kyoto, Japan program. Professor Ravitch is an internationally renowned author and speaker on issues related to law and religion in both the U.S. and Japan. Welcome to Just Liberty, Professor Ravitch.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And I think we're all on a first name basis on this show. We try to keep it a little more casual, but I guess we're talking about a Louisiana law today requiring something to do with "In God We Trust." What is it that the good folks of Louisiana trust in and want to proclaim to the world there?
Yeah, it's a part of this pattern of model laws that have been getting adopted in different places, and basically it requires that every public classroom in the state, from elementary school kindergartens all the way up to college classrooms, post "In God We Trust." It sets forth the size, the focus of it. The words "In God We Trust" have to be the focus. It's got to be framed. And it also encourages in the K through 12 system that teachers teach the history of "In God We Trust" as a patriotic, concept, which is ironic when you know the actual history of the concept. But
we were discussing in a prior show that the Union, the North, put it on the coinage at the urging of the clergy, because the South put God in its constitution and was touting God on the side of the South, and the good clergy in the North wanted to invoke God on their side, and so Lincoln relented.
That's some of the history. Yeah, there was a lot of concern about it being sacrilegious at the time. It did get put on coins, but they did not put it on paper money. And it certainly was not the national motto. It became the national motto really after the McCarthy era, as a response to communism. In 1956, much more recently, it was made the national motto. And if you look at the history of that, it was very much during the Red Scare. It was accompanied by a lot of discrimination against atheists that was occurring during that time. And it did not come on the paper money until 1957. So contrary to what apparently a lot of Louisiana legislators assumed, this was not part of a long American history of "In God We Trust" as the national motto, nor was it part of a long history of "In God We Trust" being a non-controversial thing on money. It wasn't on paper money until 1957, wasn't the national motto until 1956. And actually, shortly after it was put on the coins, both President Grant and later President Theodore Roosevelt wanted to take it off because Grant viewed it as a violation of concepts of separation, and Roosevelt was really came right out and said, I'm really concerned this borders on sacrilege. This could be sacrilegious. So it wasn't even uncontroversial at the time that it was adopted and shortly thereafter. So why Louisiana wants to go down that path, I think, has very little to do with actual history, actual tradition, with any actual understanding of what even led to this being adopted as the national motto, which was a fear of communism, not religious concerns. I think this is about power.
Right. And that is my question. I mean, just hearing that history, you mentioned at the outset that this is a model law and that it's been passed in some other states, it's pending in some other state legislatures. So, and you say power is fueling it. Unpack that a little bit. What do you mean by power?
If you look at the groups that are doing this, there's a lot of sort of pounding on the chest and saying, this is what we are. We're a religious nation, mostly really the concept is a Christian nation. And they don't mean all Christians when they're saying that. It's part of something that is at least Christian nationalist adjacent. Governor Edwards, who is certainly not a Christian nationalist, signed it into law, which is somewhat shocking. It passed 99-0 in one of the houses of the Louisiana legislature. So certainly not everybody involved in this is a Christian nationalist, but the groups promoting this kind of a law, and the spirit behind it is, at the very least, I think you could say, Christian nationalist adjacent. If not directly. So I think you've got to look at, why would people want this? What is this saying to people in these public schools? It's saying that we're associating patriotism with God and seemingly a particular view on God. There was certainly no great call for this law from non-Christians and groups like the Seventh-day Adventists and many other Christian groups that oppose this law. It strikes me that this is about doing exactly the opposite of what is written in Matthew about, I'm not Christian, so I'm not claiming to be, but I have studied, as a law and religion scholar, I've studied Christianity and other religions in great depth. And, there's that line in Matthew that you should go into the closet, and the God that hears you in quiet will reward you in quiet. And this seems directly against that. This seems about shoving religion into the faces of children from kindergarten up to college students. So it seems to me to be about power. As a non-Christian in particular, it seems to me to be about power, because I know they're not talking about my God, but who technically is the same God.
That begs the question, right? Who is the God and who is trusting, in God? Is it the Christian God? Is it the Jewish God? Is it the, God forbid, the Muslim God? Which I say that because that would be how many Christians would maybe respond to that, right? I think it makes assumptions about who God is that are not universally shared.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the implication, and we have the best evidence of that from Texas, where a similar law was passed, and a parent in one school district tried to submit, because what they're trying to do is say, well, you can donate. We'll take donations of these. Where a parent in a school district tried to submit one that was with a rainbow background, but clearly met the requirements of the law, "In God we trust," and it was rejected. They then tried submitting it in Arabic, same exact words, and it was rejected. If I'm Jewish, if I tried to submit it in
In
Hebrew,
Hebrew.
I'm sure it would get rejected. So, the, and ironically there, it could be both a combination of anti-Semitism and anti-Islamicism. They may not have a problem with it in Hebrew, but then they'd be worried with them. Maybe we'll get it in Arabic. But what's wrong with that? Right? I mean, if your goal is, to not have a sectarian notion, then why does it have to be in English? Right? Oh, that's our national mottos in English. Right, but you want to teach the history of the national motto, which suggests that it was connected to anti-communism. That's what I suggest in my article, and in the conversation is fine. Teach the real history. Teach how it was connected to anti-atheism. Teach how it wasn't based in religion. It was based in a reaction to communism. Teach that history. Teach that Theodore Roosevelt thought it was sacrilegious, and that many people throughout U.S. religious history would have thought it was sacrilegious. Teach it. Teach that.
It intrigues me that a lot of the rhetoric around the passage of this legislation, not just in Louisiana, but in other states that have similar legislation, it's often advanced under the banner of religious liberty. What is that saying about people's understanding of religious liberty?
As someone who has written a lot about religious liberty, this doesn't even come close to what anybody that advocates for religious liberty, even those who are more extreme, would view as religious liberty. Your religious liberty is about yourself and your church or synagogue or mosque or temple. It is about the connection of individuals and religious entities to government. It's not about using government to promote your religion. That's not what nobody, even those who are asserting really strong complicity-based claims under Hobby Lobby, even they're not arguing that you have a right to force other people to do that. And that's what this law does. It forces other
But I'm going to take issue with you, because I think that while that may not be explicitly stated, I think it is the kind of underlying principle behind a case like we were discussing before we started, Kennedy against Bremerton, where you have the high school football coach explicitly using his position as a government employee, as a coach in a public school, to promote prayer and to promote his faith and to encourage the students to participate. And the court said that was okay. I think it very much is about manipulating government to support and promote religion.
Well, I mean, as we talked about before, this, yeah, I mean, I'm not a fan of the Kennedy decision for sure. And I do think that it was a manipulation by the court of the concept of religious freedom and free speech, actually, in that context as well, to allow Coach Kennedy to win. With that said, I don't even think that argument's available here, because here it's the state government itself that's doing it. I think and as we discussed, I think it's highly questionable that Kennedy actually had a valid religious liberty claim when you look at the real facts in the Kennedy case, which are not the facts set forth by the majority. You don't see those facts until you see them in the dissenting opinion, along with pictures to really show these actually are the facts. But in Louisiana, they don't even have the argument that Kennedy had, which again, I think the court misinterpreted in Kennedy. But here in Louisiana, the state legislature is the one doing this. So they don't even have Kennedy to hide behind, which is ironic, because as we talked about before, Kennedy is not a good decision. But even if we assume for the sake of argument, that it is somehow a valid decision. Um, Louisiana can't even hide behind that, which makes the religious liberty arguments that some made in Louisiana legislature, you know, we have to assume they absolutely have no concept of what the term religious liberty actually means, even in its broadest sense, or we have to assume they're being disingenuous, which is what I think was going on. But
Do you think that what we're seeing both at the Supreme Court and also in general discourse, public discourse around religious liberty, is that it used to be seen through the prism of minority rights, protecting religious minorities in a society that is predominantly of another faith. Whereas now it seems in many of the cases that we're seeing come through the pipeline, they're dealing with majority religious rights. And so the whole paradigm has sort of been flipped, right?
see, I think you both have read my article without actually having read my article, because everything you're talking about, actually in the article I have on Kennedy, that's the last section, is all about how it hurts. It's Kennedy and Carson v. Macon. It's all about how this hurts religious minorities. That we've had a court over at least since 2020 that, and I would argue further, but certainly at least since 2020, that has flipped both scripts. So the Establishment Clause has always, as Justice O'Connor wrote in her last concurrence under the Establishment Clause in McCreary County, where she wrote, do we really want to become a theocracy? America is the most religious of the G7 countries. And that's probably because of the Establishment Clause. We protect religious minorities and we protect broader religious entities, more dominant religious entities, by keeping government's nose out of it. That's the way we can protect both at the same time. And this court has flipped the script on that. Now it seems that the Establishment Clause protects only, if anybody, it protects social conservatives, but it really doesn't protect anybody so much anymore. It's been made beholden to the Free Exercise Clause, which they're now interpreting to require that state governments, never mind federalism even, they're interpreting it to suggest that state governments now have to fund religious schools if they fund other private schools. And we all know that most religious minorities don't have the numbers to have their own religious schools. And what the discrimination concept that they're using in free exercise that started with the Church of Lukumi Babalu Ivy, City of Hialeah, which was clearly designed to protect a religious minority that was being persecuted there, has now come to benefit predominantly social conservatives. I'm not saying it shouldn't benefit social conservatives, but that shouldn't be the primary thing it's doing.
Well, the irony here, Frank, is that the right has been pushing this notion of a one-way wall that's supposed to protect the church autonomy from the state, but basically allow the state to promote and fund religion as much as it wants. And the irony to me is that when government gets its nose under the religious tent, it destroys religion. And that's the lesson of, if you want to say the G7, the difference between religious vitality in the US and religious lack of vitality in post-Christian Europe is post-Christian Europe has been funding religion for a long time. And in America, religion has been left to fend for itself in kind of free market, you live or die because of your own ability to be relevant and meet the needs of your constituents. And the more that We become lazy and dependent on government handouts for education and government promotion of "In God We Trust" and all kinds of symbolism and what have you. Ultimately, our religious vitality will suffer.
I think that's true. Absolutely true. I mean, there was that survey done years ago. Why so few British people attend church? And a lot of them will say, "Well, they forced me to pray when I was in school. I did enough of it." And that was
Right.
one of the main answers that you would get from people. And and you can go back even to Roger Williams, right? I mean, the wall of separation, there's the Jeffersonian model,
Mhm.
right? Which is that the wall is designed to protect the government and civil society from religion. But there's also, and de Tocqueville points out, whether the people in the 1810s were familiar with Roger Williams or not, certainly the concept was alive and well, which is that there should be a strong hedge wall between government and civil society. I mean, between government and civil society and religion, to keep the wilderness of civil society and government out of the garden of religion. So that hedge wall is important to protect religion from government. And I think that those who have been pushing for this, and some of these people are people that I'm friendly with. I know, some of the lawyers in Alliance Defending Freedom and others. We disagree on many, 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 many things. But I what I always say, but they're my friends. We lawyers. That's one of the things I do like about law and religion is we could talk after we disagree, unlike society more broadly now. And I will say, I think they're going to come to regret it. I think they're already regretting Hobby Lobby because, it killed RIFRA in my state of Michigan. Um, and it killed a RIFRA in Georgia, which ultimately made it through. And it's turned discussion over religious freedom and religious liberty. It's changed it from protecting Native Americans and Seventh-day Adventists and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and others, into it being an excuse to discriminate, because for-profit corporations now can use it to discriminate. And it has lowered the protections given under state RFRAs at the very least in many states. And I think in future generations, ultimately, it's going to be the undoing of RFRAs,
Mm.
which are very important. My colleague Chris Lund did a study on this. To this day, over 90% of those who are winning RFRA cases, whether a state or federal, are Native Americans, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus. And that's what RFRA was designed for. It doesn't mean that a mainline Protestant or an evangelical Christian or a Roman Catholic shouldn't be able to win a RFRA claim. They should be able to win a RFRA claim, but even they're less likely to win nowadays because of Hobby Lobby. And I think that we're going to see the same pushback against religious freedom now because the court has redefined it. And again, it doesn't mean I don't have sympathy for people who have complicity concerns. I have great sympathy for those people, but that doesn't mean their companies should be winning these cases. It doesn't mean that their claims are made up or invalid as a matter of theology, but it does mean that they shouldn't be getting exemptions to anti-discrimination laws if we really want to protect religious freedom in the long run. Because I don't think it's long for this earth, or at least for this American experiment, right? We'll still have religious exemptions in Japan where it's enshrined pretty much. But I don't think it's going to stay in the US, where probably more people want them or need them, because the younger generation views religious freedom as an excuse to discriminate. And that's all on this court.
Yeah, yeah. And on that very somber note, we'll have to leave the interview, but Frank, it has been such an enlightening conversation, both on the history side and the legal side, and also your prognostications of the future of religious freedom. And that's something we're all concerned about. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much.
No, it's been my pleasure. And
We need to do this again.
yeah, I'm happy
We
to
do.
do it again. And I hope my prognostications are inaccurate.
I do too. I do too. Well, that interview opened a whole can of worms, right?
It did, and it went in a lot of different directions that I didn't really expect.
Right. And we ended up on RFRA, which is a whole other discussion that we need to have, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, for anyone who's not familiar with it.
And he also used a term that I don't think our listeners are familiar with, complicity, right? Talking about those with complicity concerns, and what that addresses is, like the example would be the cake baker who feels that if they bake a cake in celebration of a same-sex wedding, that they are complicit in
Right.
sin, that they regard the same-sex wedding as sinful, and that makes them complicit. So they would be sinning. That's the basic concept.
Right. Right. But it is a whole other area of discussion which we need to have.
I was interested in what he reported, that in England, when asked why people are less religious, they say, well, I prayed when I was in school, I had enough of it. And it makes me think of two things. One, that I doubt that the prayer they were taught was biblical. That it was the opening of the heart to God as to a friend, which is what I was taught prayer is, right? But also, I'm reminded of the response that so many Americans who check none as their religious affiliation give when asked why not. And it has to do with the association of religion and politics.
Right.
When government and religion get mixed up, it drives people away. It's counterproductive. And I think this is something that in the drive for power, conservative folks are overlooking to the detriment of the gospel.
There's concerns from that aspect. There's also concerns from the fact that when government funds religion, then ultimately it feels that it has a say in religion. And I speak from experience from the Australian background, where religious schools are funded significantly by the government and have been for decades. And so when you have the issue of maintaining a religious identity over questions such as who you hire, then the government does not see any merit in your argument.
Well, that brings us square to what we call the golden rule.
Yes.
Not the do unto others version, but that other golden rule that he who's got the gold makes the rules.
This has been Just Liberty, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Bettina Krause, here with Alan Reineck. Until next week, remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.